And I challenge all of these Christian apologists, if they're willing to have a discussion with me on this, I will prove to them that they actually are heretics or representing heretical positions according to the mainstream Orthodox with a lowercase o teaching. Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back to JBrancatella 2.0, and today we have another interesting and exciting episode. This video is going to expose, inshallah, on a large scale, a little known heresy that Muslims and Christians are not very familiar with. What is this heresy? This heresy typically comes up in Muslim-Christian debates and dialogues when Muslims press Christians on the deity of Christ. They say passages in the Gospels like in Mark 13:32, Matthew 24:36, where Jesus is said to not know the hour, they say, God knows everything, so if Jesus is God, how could he not know the hour? Now, one frequent and regular response by many Christian apologists is to say that, well, Jesus had two natures. He had a divine nature and a human nature. And in his human nature, he was ignorant of the hour. He did not know when the hour was going to happen, or when Judgment Day or his second coming was going to take place. But what many Christian apologists and even Muslims watching these debates don't know is that this position is considered heretical according to the dogmatic teachings of the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox churches, and even some Protestant churches. What is this heresy? The heresy is to say that Christ was ignorant of the hour, his second coming, or the judgment day in his human nature. You cannot say that even in his human nature, he did not know when the hour was going to take place. Now, I'm not saying that this is the correct position. Obviously, I don't believe that it's the correct position as a Muslim. But I'm just explaining that this is the dogmatic teaching of the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and even some Protestant churches. So I'm going to show a couple examples of this heresy taking place in real time, where Catholic apologists, or more generally, Christian apologists, are using this response. Muslims are correcting them to tell them, you can't have this interpretation of your scripture. You need to say something else. This is heretical according to the teachings of your own church. And the Catholic and Christian apologists don't know this, don't understand this. So we're having to teach them their own theology in real time. I'm going to go to the first example of this in a recent debate that took place between a Catholic apologist, Lewis, and a Muslim da'i, Orthodox Muslim or Libyano. Assalamu alaikum everyone. If you're enjoying this video and the other content on my channel and would like to continue to do so and see my channel grow, then please consider supporting my work at the pinned links at the top of the description of this video, as well as in the comment section. Your support is much needed and appreciated. Barakallahu feek. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless and reward you all. Let's take a look at this.
Now, let's talk about Mark 13:32. Jesus says, of the day and the hour no one knows. And Libyano is correct. I am Catholic, so I believe whatever the Catholic Catechism tells me. And in paragraph 472, the Catechism actually talks about the human knowledge of Jesus and how it is limited. It says this: this human soul that the Son of Man assumed is endowed with a true human knowledge. As such, this knowledge cannot in itself be unlimited. It was exercised in the historical conditions of his existence in space and time. In fact, this is directly connected to the Carmen Christi. Remember that the Carmen Christi talks about Jesus emptying himself, so that verb ekenosin. So he empties himself in the sense of relinquishing the use of certain divine prerogatives during his earthly ministry. which is not the same thing as no longer having them all together. As Walter Wessel and Mark Strauss point out in their commentary on Mark, they say, Jesus purposefully but temporarily laid aside the exercise of his omniscience as part of what was involved in becoming a human being. In fact, there are other places in the Gospels where it says Jesus knows all things. So evidently, the omniscience is still there. It's not just active at this point.
In Mark 13, did you?
So there you have Lewis attempting to respond anyway to Liviano's objection that he is not able to actually say that Jesus did not know the hour in his human nature. Now, Lewis recognizes and admits that he's a Catholic, so he should be beholden to the teachings of the Catholic Church. Now, Lewis then goes on to quote the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where it teaches that Jesus' human knowledge was limited in certain respects. And this is true, that this is part of the Catholic teaching, but what Lewis doesn't know and recognize and go into enough detail on the different aspects of Christ's human knowledge and his intellect. There are three main aspects, right? And there are different technical terms that are typically used to describe this, but I'm going to try to break them down in simple English, right? So the first aspect has to do with knowledge of everything actual, things that have taken place in the past, things that are happening now, and everything that will actually occur in the future. You can talk about this as like factual knowledge of things that will take place. Now, Christ, in the Catholic teaching, has knowledge of all of these things. So you can't say that he was ignorant of something that happened in the past, or a factual event that took place, or something that is taking place now, or that will take place in the future. And that includes knowledge of the hour, okay, or knowledge of the second coming or judgment day. Then there's a second category, which is sometimes called infused knowledge. And it's the type of knowledge or the mode of knowledge in which angels have knowledge. Catholics teach that angels don't have knowledge based on experience through sensory data or something like that. It's more of an immediate infused knowledge in their spirits, okay? And in that respect, Christ had all knowledge, and he was not knowing things on the fly or becoming aware of new things in that way, okay? So that's in the second aspect or second mode or way of knowing something. In the third mode or way of knowing something, this has to do with respect to experiential knowledge or knowledge through the senses or sensory data by seeing things, smelling things, touching things, so on and so forth. And in that respect, Catholics teach that Jesus did increase in knowledge in the sense of experiencing new things through his senses. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that according to Catholics. He did have this new sensory experience and was actually learning in that sense of experiencing things through his five senses. But in terms of factual knowledge of things that will take place, he knows all things, right? So sometimes this is called experiential knowledge. He grew in experiential knowledge in the sense that he did experience new things, but he knew that those things were going to take place. It's not as if he was caught off guard by them in that sense. Now, Lewis appeals to Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, where it teaches that Christ, quote unquote, emptied himself, right? And he says, and this is a quote directly from Lewis, he says that he emptied himself in the sense of relinquishing certain divine prerogatives during his earthly ministry, which is not the same as no longer having them altogether. And then he goes on to read a commentary on the screen that attempts to support his interpretation. And the commentary says, and I quote, that he temporarily laid aside the exercise of his omniscience. Now, what the important thing to note is, this isn't even talking about Christ's human nature. This is talking about his divine nature, that even in his divine nature, while he was a human being on earth, he temporarily laid aside the exercise of his omniscience. It's not even talking about the exercising of omniscience in his human nature. It's saying that he temporarily laid aside the exercise of omniscience in his divine nature. And this is sometimes called kenotic Christology because it gets its name from the word kenosis, which in Greek means to empty or temporarily lay aside, in Philippians chapter 2, verse 7. And this is what Lewis is appealing to. But this isn't just the agnoete heresy. This is an additional heresy, which is called kenoticism, sometimes called kenotic Christology. And in the form that Lewis is representing it, it is heretical, because you cannot say that in his divine nature, God or the Son went from actively knowing all things to temporarily laying that knowledge aside and not having that knowledge active in his divine intellect or his divine nature or his divine mind. So this is a second heresy that Lewis is committing, and it's something which is even more dangerous, because he's not only saying that Christ did not know the hour in his human nature, he's saying that Christ temporarily laid aside his omniscience, or at least active omniscience, in terms of actively knowing all things at one time, even in his divine nature. So this is a more outrageous heresy that Lewis is committing here. Lewis goes on to say, the omniscience is still there. So he explains what he means by temporarily laying the omniscience aside. He says the omniscience, and I quote, the omniscience is still there. It's just not active at this point. And what he's referring to is when he says he doesn't know the hour, his divine omniscience is not active at that point. It's not that he completely lost it. It's that it's not what's sometimes called in philosophy a current or active knowledge. It's something, it goes from knowledge being active to knowledge in potency. Okay, so it's that he has it kind of in the back of his mind, but he's not actively thinking of it at that time. And that's our heretical position to hold as well. So anyway, let's continue here. Now we'll go to the section where Libiano comes after that to respond and actually is going to press Lewis on some of the things that he said during cross-examination section. Let's take a listen.
In Mark 13, did Jesus know the hour?
Nope, he did not know the hour.
Oh, okay. Are you a Catholic?
Yes.
Did you know that? Good. Did you know that Catholics have deemed this to be a heresy called the agnoete heresy?
I literally quoted the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
The Catechism says that humanity doesn't know?
It says here that he had a human knowledge that was limited. That's in paragraph 472.
No, I'm talking about the person. Did he know? Not talking about whether he had a limited nature. Did the person know?
Knowing is something that is predicated of the nature in this case.
Wait, the person doesn't know? You can't say the person knew?
Yeah. Well, again, that's why we, again, when it comes to predication, knowledge is something that is attached to the person, but the nature.
Right, but it's predicated to subjects, right? Natures don't know things, persons know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did Jesus know or not?
He did not know.
So there, Lewis, in that section, right, Libiano is directly asking him, did Jesus know the hour? And he said, nope, quote, nope, he did not know the hour. So he didn't even say, oh, he didn't know it in his human nature, but he knew it in his divine nature. He didn't even say that. He just said, full stop, nope, he did not know the hour. Then Libiano asked him again, and he repeats, he did not know. As a person, he did not know the hour, right? Now, let's move on to the next part, which is very important.
Can God not know something at any time?
Nope, not unless he chooses to.
So Jesus is not God. Wait, you said he could choose not to?
He can choose to relinquish that prerogative.
What does it mean to relinquish knowledge? What does that mean?
To not make use of it even when you have access to it.
Wow, so listen to that. Libiano then is trying to make the point, since you said Jesus didn't know the hour, then he can't be God. So he asks the question, can God not know something at any time? Can God not know something? This is not talking about the human nature. It's talking about the divine nature. Lewis says, nope, not unless he chooses to. So he's claiming that God can choose to not know something in his divine nature. Wow, this is quite shocking.
Choose not to?
He can choose to relinquish that prerogative.
What does it mean to relinquish knowledge? What does that mean?
To not make use of it even when you have access to it.
No, it doesn't say. It doesn't say I don't make use of it. It says I don't know it.
So there, Lewis is explaining further. I'm not putting words into his mouth. He says, quote, he can choose to relinquish that prerogative. And Libiano asks, what do you mean by that? He says, to not make use of it even when you have access to it. So that's exactly the distinction that I'm making. And this is something that came up in my debate with Dr. Andrew Loke, who's supposed to be an expert on Christology, wrote an entire book on it. And Lewis seems to be representing that same view. There are different forms of canonicism. Sometimes the view is called ontological canonicism, which means that he literally lost entirely, let's say, his divine omniscience. And another form of it seems to be what Andrew Loke, he explicitly admits this, and Lewis are representing here, which is sometimes called functional canonicism. Means that God still has knowledge of all things, but he goes from that knowledge being occurrent or active to it going to mere potentiality, right? So he has access to it in some sense. If he really wants to dig deep, he can access it, right? But it's not active on the forefront of his mind, so to speak, at all times. And this is functional canonicism, which is heretical according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, which I'll go on to demonstrate in just a minute. So Lewis is guilty of two heresies, canonic Christology, and he's also guilty of the agnoete heresy of Jesus not knowing in his divine nature, but also the canonic heresy of him not knowing or not having active knowledge even in his divine nature. And he says to relinquish that divine omniscience prerogative in his divine nature means to not make use of it even when you have access to it. So you have access to it, but it's not active. It's knowledge in mere potentia or potency, right? And then he says Jesus relinquishes the use of that knowledge, right? So this is all what Lewis is openly and explicitly teaching and saying. Let's continue further here.
Does he know it, or does he just not use it?
This is where I would connect it to the kenosis language in Philippians 2:7. He emptied himself.
Has no connection. I don't know. I'm asking you what it means to empty knowledge.
It means that you have that prerogative, you choose not to make use of it on a temporary basis.
Does Jesus say he has knowledge and doesn't use it, or does he say I don't have knowledge? He
doesn't have to use those words because we don't isolate text, we connect them together.
No, you don't isolate text. Well, Philippians doesn't talk about knowledge. I'm asking you, what does it mean to empty out your knowledge? Knowledge is a predicate where you either know or you don't know. So did Jesus not know?
I'll give you an analogy. I have a very extensive library of books on verbum, so I can access that.
I don't have it.
Look, am I allowed to answer the question?
You're talking to me about books. I'm asking you a question.
Am I allowed to use an analogy to answer the question?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Hurry up.
Okay. Let me use the analogy then. So my verbum has a very extensive library. There's a lot of knowledge contained in it, and I can access it at any time. And admittedly, I have been using my verbum library very extensively during our debate. Now, I could have chosen...
Well, you should have been using it to actually know that you were committing multiple heresies.
Go buy physical books or what I have stored in my head knowledge. So Jesus relinquishes the use of that knowledge analogically to if I were to choose to relinquish my use of my verbum app during our debate.
Yeah, your verbum app is not mental knowledge. Jesus is speaking about mental knowledge. Did Jesus have mental knowledge or not?
Yeah, it's an analogy. All analogies break down.
There's no analog. An analogy is supposed to have an analog that parallels. Did Jesus have mental knowledge of the hour?
No, he did not.
All right, so he can't be God because God always has mental knowledge. Thank you.
Okay. And Dean responds says,
Wow. So Lewis explicitly says that Jesus did not have mental knowledge of the hour. And he's very clear in representing functional canonicism, which is to say that he did not make use of the knowledge even if he had access to it. And his analogy was basically like, you can have stored data on your computer and it can be there and you can access it at any time, even if it's not active on your mind, and you can't just boom, just all of a sudden it's there. You can go into your computer data and access these texts and see what's there, but it's not always active on your mind. The example that Andrew Loke frequently gives, it's like, well, all human beings, after the stage of infancy, basically know that 1 + 1 = 2, right? So JBrancatella knows that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. I know it, but it's not active on my mind at all times, right? So this is the view of functional canonicism, that it's basically in the back of your mind that you could access, or you can access it in your computer data, but it's not active on your mind at all times, right? And this is heretical, and I'll show why further on. Let's continue, though, listening to what this conversation back and forth will bring.
Did Jesus have mental knowledge of the hour?
No, he did not.
All right.
Yeah, so Lewis says that he did not have mental knowledge of the hour, and Libiano is going to point out, well, then that means that he wasn't actually God.
All right, so he can't be God because God always has mental knowledge. Thank you.
okay. And Dean responds says, you can't say that Jesus doesn't know the hour in his human nature. Lofton made a video yesterday. It's the Agnoite heresy. Are you aware of this?
Yeah, actually, again, to emphasize, what I'm saying is from the Catechism itself. I literally quoted the exact paragraph from the Catechism where it says what I just said. So I'm not out of bounds in what I'm saying here.
Yeah, I think Lewis has, maybe he hasn't studied his faith deeply enough. He's too busy studying Quranic variants. But I'm not sure if you knew, Lewis, but it is absolutely a heresy that takes you outside of Catholicism, because it implies Nestorianism if you say that Jesus didn't know, the person didn't know in his humanity. You are essentially splitting Jesus into two persons. And that's why this heresy was condemned as the heresy of the Agnoite. Yes, Michael Lofton, our host today, did make a video on this last night.
Okay.
So there in that part, Dean is actually sending in a super chat question, and he says that Michael Lofton, the Catholic host and moderator, which just must have been extremely awkward for Michael, the host, and he's actually friends with Lewis, he explicitly condemned this as a heresy according to the Catholic Church just a couple days prior to this debate on his own channel. So, wow, that was kind of shocking. And Lewis, in response, thinks he's not actually representing a heretical position. He keeps appealing to the Catechism of saying that Jesus did not have complete or perfect or infinite knowledge in his human mind or human intellect, without recognizing that the Catholic Church, when it's saying that in the Catechism, is merely referring to experiential knowledge, but not knowledge of facts, as if he was ignorant of the hour. That's the key distinction that Lewis is failing to recognize or admit of.
They did make a video on this last night.
Okay. Dean asks, Libiano, can you display a source on the Agnoite?
Yeah. I was actually going to read this to show that my friend here is completely ignorant on Catholic dogma. Excuse me. I'm just going to download this quick. And yeah, so here, John Henry Newman, Roman Catholic Writings on Doctrinal Development, Thesis 9, pages 48, 49. He says, it is well known among serious students of theology that some of the 4th century fathers spoke of the knowledge of Christ's soul in such a way as to suggest that they did not believe it to have been perfect from the very moment of his conception in Mary's womb, but to have begun growing as he advanced in age, as the evangelist says. It is Catholic dogma that the man or human nature assumed by the word did not have, abstractly speaking, or in first act, as they say, perfect knowledge, but that really, or in second act, he did have it, because the man was deified in the word. Thus, Christ as a man would never have been ignorant of anything a man could know. As Gregory the Great expresses, he knew in the nature, but not from the nature of his humanity, which is exactly what I was saying. So I'd love for Luis to deal with that quickly here, and please apologize to all the Catholics for messing up and committing heresy.
Actually, funny enough, Gregory.
So Dean then sends in another question, and he's asking Libiano to give a source to show that this is not just something he's coming up with out of his own mind. And what he displays on the screen is actually a slide from my presentation on Dean's channel. And I'm actually very happy that Libiano used it. I'm happy that Dean and Libiano are making use of much of my material, and others as well, because I don't really care. It's not about me being the forefront of this stuff. I want my work and my research to actually go far out there. And Libiano and Dean are two people who are actually making good use of a lot of my research. And this is one perfect example of this, where Libiano is using it midstream in the middle of a debate, an important debate, and showing and displaying that Lewis is actually representing a heretical understanding of Christ according to his own church. So I'm very happy about this. I have no problem whatsoever. I hope people share my work and material far and wide and make good use of it, as Libiano and Dean have been doing. Alhamdulillah. So he quotes and he uses the slide that mentions John Henry Newman about what he says about this agnoete heresy. And Lewis still thinks that he's in agreement with what Newman is saying here. So watch his interpretation, and I'll show how on its own slide, it actually condemns his interpretation of what he's saying. Let's take a look.
Gregory the Great summarizes. If you can pull up that quote again, put it back on the screen. Put it back on the screen.
Yeah, I removed it, so let me put it back here.
Yeah, because there's a couple of key lines in there that actually make my point. So it says there by St. Newman, he did not have, abstractly speaking, or in the first act, as they say, perfect knowledge. So that's the sense in which I'm saying that the human nature did not have it. And also the quote by Gregory the Great at the end.
Can you finish? Can you finish? Because you didn't finish.
Yeah, or in the second act, he did have it because the man was deified in the word. That's actually in the context.
Christ as a man would have not been ignorant.
I didn't interrupt you when you responded to my responses.
Sorry, my bad. My bad. It's my bad.
So I expect. Okay, no problem. I'll let it slide. Anyway. When it says the man was deified in the word, that's referring to Christ's glorification, which takes place at his ascension back into heaven. Now, also in the end, notice what Gregory the Great says. My tongue is getting dry. He knew
his tongue is getting dry, man. I wonder why.
The nature, but not from the nature of his humanity. So when the Son says the Son does not know, Gregory the Great is actually explaining what that means there, not from the nature of his humanity, which again corresponds to paragraph 472 of the Catechism. The Catechism is just explaining it in simple language so that non-specialists in all these technical terms can understand what is being said.
All right. Okay.
Unfortunately, that's the exact opposite of what Newman is saying there. So Lewis quotes the Newman part where it says that the man was deified in the word, and he says that is referring to Christ's glorification, which takes place at his ascension back into heaven. So he's saying that Christ, when he made the statement of not knowing the hour, that was true. He didn't know the hour. But then he goes and actually knows the hour when his human nature becomes glorified. And Lewis says that that takes place at his ascension back into heaven. But Newman says exactly the opposite. Why? Because he's claiming that Christ's knowledge in his human nature was, quote, perfect from the very moment of his conception in Mary's womb, which was in the quote on the page when Lewis was reading it and Libiano just read it. So Newman is condemning the idea that Jesus didn't know the hour in his human nature at any point. He's saying that he knew it from the very conception and moment of conception in Mary's womb. So it's not saying what you claim, Lewis, at all. Now, for people who think that maybe Jake and Libiano and Dean are just misrepresenting what Catholic dogmatic teaching says, I'm going to go to another recent video which took place in light of Muslims having to teach Catholics and Christian apologists what they actually are supposed to teach and believe. And it's not just, to be fair, it's not just Lewis, it's also what took place with Dean and this guy Chris from Speaker's Corner, as he calls himself, or Rob from Sentinel Apologetics. Both of them were arguing with Dean and saying that Dean was misrepresenting Catholic or Christian dogmatic teaching on this point. And it's just due to their own ignorance. They don't know. They don't actually read. They spend too much time trying to debunk Islam without knowing what their own church teaches on these points. Here is a Catholic apologist by the name of Christian Wagner, who I've had on my channel once before, and he gives you the full context of why he's saying what he's saying. So let's take a listen to what Christian has to say here. And he is a Catholic and somebody who actually reads in his tradition.
The worst cases, sometimes in their process of trying to defend the teaching of the Catholic Church, what they will do is they will actually oppose the teaching of the Catholic Church. They will actually oppose a dogma or doctrine of the Catholic Church in trying to defend her. So when it comes to Christology, there was actually a recent example of this that I mentioned when it comes to the intellect, the human intellect of Christ. When it comes to the human intellect of Christ, there is this tendency of people to have errors or even heresies in the way in which they describe Christology, well, the way in which they describe the human intellect of Christ in Catholic Christology.
So there, Christian is setting up the discussion and explaining why he's making this video. He says the worst case or the worst example of many Christian and Catholic apologists today is when they do what? And I quote, when they are trying to defend the teachings of the Catholic Church, but they actually wind up opposing the teachings of the Catholic Church, which is something that Lewis did and something that Rob and Chris from Speaker's Corner did with Dean as well. He says they actually wind up opposing the teachings of the Catholic Church. They will oppose a dogma or a teaching of the Catholic Church. And then he says and gives an example that when it comes to Christology, there's actually a recent example of this when it comes to the human intellect of Christ, the human nature of Christ. He says there is a tendency where people have errors or even heresies in the way in which they describe the human intellect of Christ in Catholic Christology. Okay, so he's explaining what the heresy is. He's setting it up, what many of these people do, and these are the people that he has in mind, like Chris from Speaker's Corner, Rob from Sentinel Apologetics, or Lewis, right? And it's not only them. I'm going to show that there are other people doing the same thing. So let's continue him explaining what the heresy actually is.
People will say is they'll say, okay, when I read these passages which seem to imply ignorance of Christ, what we need to do is we actually just need to apply this to his humanity. So they'll say, well, Christ, according to his deity, he was infinite in knowledge and wisdom. He obviously has his knowledge of simple intelligence, knowledge of vision, etc. Christ has this, according to his divine mind, he has this infinitude of knowledge. But they'll say when the passages talk about the ignorance of Christ, they mean this according to his humanity, like we would in a number of other passages where we do partitive exegesis. But the problem with this is that's completely wrong. But when it comes to certain Muslims, they will say,
wow, that is completely wrong. Did you hear that, Lewis? Did you hear that, Rob? Did you hear that, Chris from Speaker's Corner? He told you, this is a Catholic telling you this is completely wrong. And what is he saying is completely wrong? He says what some of these people do, which is what all three of them have done, and not only them, is that when they read passages in the Bible that seem to imply the ignorance of Christ, what they do is they just apply it to his humanity, and they say that he's ignorant of the hour, or he's ignorant of all these different things with respect or in his human nature. They will say things like, according to his divinity, he knows all things, or he's omniscient, but according to his humanity, he was ignorant. And they'll apply those passages and say that he was ignorant of these things according to his humanity. But then Christian says, the problem with this is completely wrong. So he's telling you that this is completely wrong and that this is heretical. So then let's go on and listen to him further.
But when it comes to certain Muslims, they will say, look, Christians cannot use this passage. They cannot use this reading of the passage, rather, because this is against their own dogma of their church. A lot of them will push back against this. And they're right to push back against this reading that a lot of these Christian apologists will bring, which try to attribute ignorance to the human intellect of Christ. They're completely right to push back about this.
So Christian is noting that Muslims have been pushing back on this. People like Dean against Rob and Chris. People like Libiano against Lewis. People like me against Sam Shamoon and Avery and all these other Christian apologists. He's saying that Muslims are right to push back against this reading of some Christian apologists who try to attribute ignorance to Christ's human intellect in reference to these passages of Christ not knowing the hour. He says Muslims are completely right to push back about this, right? And then let's listen to what he says here further.
Well, I do very much appreciate the fact that a lot of the apologists who are out there, the Christian apologists who are out there, that they are being corrected. Like the fact that, you can't say these things. It's good because they recognize that. I hope they don't dig their heels and they recognize that, they need to conform to the teaching of the church.
So there, Wagner is saying he actually is appreciating the Muslims. He's appreciating the Muslims that they're pushing back against this interpretation of the text by Christian apologists and telling them that this is heretical and telling them this goes against the dogmatic teachings of the church. Wagner is saying that he appreciates Muslims correcting the Christian apologists on this. And he says why Wagner is appreciative of this is that he hopes that these Christian apologists recognize their heretical errors, they'll learn more, and they'll come back and conform to the teachings of the church. Now, Wagner here is going to get a question from one of his viewers about this issue.
And they recognize that, they need to conform to the teaching of the church. Isn't this exactly what happened when William Lane Craig debated hijab? William Lane Craig got ran over on his non-Catholic theology. Yeah, this is something which happens a lot of times.
So there you have it. The viewer is making the analogy to what happened with William Lane Craig in his debate with Muhammad Hijab, who I trained Muhammad Hijab for that debate. I shared all this information with him about Trinitarian teaching and the Orthodox understanding of it, what is said to be true from Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and even most Protestant churches. And William Lane Craig was exposed as a heretic because he does not actually hold to the correct understanding of Trinitarian Orthodox teachings. Now, very much in the same way and analogously, that's what happened with Chris from Speaker's Corner, Rob, as well as now Lewis in this debate. And it's not only them, guys. As I said, Sam Shamoon has made these statements, Avery, pretty much all of your favorite Christian apologists at one point or another have given this response as saying Christ is ignorant of the hour in his human nature, and this is the agnoeta heresy. But in addition to that, Lewis actually committed the heresy of kenoticism, right? So let me show that and let me display that for you guys. So here we have a text which is from the Council of Nicaea, and this is the profession of faith of the fathers. And in the Nicene Creed, they actually say at some point here, they say they're condemning a bunch of people, and they condemn those who say that they affirm that the Son of God is subject to change or alteration. These, the Catholic and Apostolic Church anathematizes. So Lewis is being anathematized in the Nicene Creed, or the teachings of the Council of Nicaea in 325. He's being anathematized because he is actually saying and affirming that Christ, in his divine intellect, in his divine mind, that he is subject to alteration or change. Why? Because he's saying that Christ's divine knowledge went from being occurrent or actual to it being merely potential, which is to say that his knowledge changed, and that is heretical according to the Catholic Church. Now, I'll show you that this is just not my interpretation of what alteration or change or divine immutability means in that sense. Let me show you what Timothy Paul says about this in relation to kenotic Christology, which Lewis was attempting to represent.
So the kenotic theory, this emptying himself theory, says Christ has all these impressive divine attributes. He becomes incarnate, becomes one of us in flesh. He temporarily gives up these attributes, empties himself of them, and then later, maybe at the exaltation, takes them all back on. So he never at one point has both the property and its complement, or the predicate and its opposite apt of him at the same time. Now, what do I say to that view? A couple things. One thing is this. On my reading of conciliar Christology, and I argue for this in the first chapter a bit and in the 8th chapter even more, conciliar Christology teaches that God is immutable. And they don't mean immutable in the way some understand it, like not fickle or true to his promises.
Which is how Sam Shamoun and Lewis understand it, by the way. Sam explicitly stated this, and I exposed him in his heresy according to Catholic teaching in another video.
They can't mean it that way because the way they use immutability is such that it's supposed to rule out ontological change on the part of the divine when the incarnation occurs. That is, they reference immutability to say how God doesn't go from being one way to another when he becomes incarnate. But of course, being not fickle or having high moral standards that you won't change are terrible reasons to think that something can't change when becoming incarnate. So they don't have that sort of weak immutability in mind. They have a much more robust sense of immutability in mind, at least on my reading of the texts. If that's the case, if they do have a very robust sense of divine immutability in play, it can't be the case that Jesus goes from being suitably impressive, like omnipotent, to being not impressive in that way and then changes back again. That is, the divine portion or element of the word isn't going to gain or lose anything, either in the incarnation or anywhere else, if this strong sense of immutability is true. So that's one reason. One reason I think the kenotic theory doesn't fit well with conciliar Christology. The second reason has to do with...
There you have it, Timothy Paul, who's supposed to be an expert in the Orthodox understanding of Christology, especially from a Catholic perspective. He's written entire texts and articles on the subject. That's supposed to be at least his expertise. Now, Paul says very clearly that the kenotic theory, which Lewis was attempting to explain, that says, and Lewis actually said this, that later at the exaltation, he gets his divine prerogatives back. Paul says that that view is heretical, and he explains what it means for the church to say that God or Christ is immutable in his divine nature. He says that it has to exclude that God goes from being one way to another when he becomes incarnate. But that's exactly what Lewis is positing. Lewis is positing that his divine intellect or divine knowledge goes from being occurrent or actual at all times to it being merely potential when he becomes incarnate, and then later at the exaltation, it goes back to being current and actual and full at all times rather than merely being potential or dispositional. So very clearly, according to Paul, Timothy Paul, Lewis is representing a heretical Christology. Now, let me go back to the Catechism, which Lewis loves to appeal to without even properly understanding. If you go to the Catechism and you go to 469, it says, "The Church thus confesses that Jesus is inseparably true God and true man. He is truly the Son of God who, without ceasing to be God and Lord, became a man and our brother." So you cannot say that Christ, in virtue of becoming incarnate or in virtue of becoming a man, that he lost some of his divine properties or even temporarily laid them aside, because that would mean that he ceased to be God. God, by necessity, knows all things at once, in the sense that he is not learning things, or in the sense that they're not fully on his mind in that quote-unquote sense at all times. No, he has active knowledge of all things that actually are taking place or took place in the past, or that will take place in the future. He knows everything that will take place in the future from eternity, and he knows that actively, not in mere potency or more potential or more in a dispositional sense. No, it's active, his knowledge. So you can't say that he went from being active in knowing all things to knowing it merely in potentiality. And then the last text that I want to quote here, okay, is actually from Pope Pius XII. So this text from Pope Pius XII, and I'll put a link to all of these things in the description of the video. This is from Sempiternus Rex Christus, and this is by Pope Pius XII, talking about the Council of Chalcedon. And there are a lot of sections of this. It's a little bit lengthy. But if you scroll down to section 29, it condemns what Lewis said as a heresy. It says, "There is another enemy of the faith of Chalcedon." So according to this, Lewis is actually an enemy of the faith of Chalcedon, widely diffused outside the fold of the Catholic religion. This is an opinion for which a rashly and falsely understood sentence of St. Paul's epistle to Philippians 2, verse 7, which is exactly what Lewis appealed to, supplies a basis and a shape for this heretical position. This is called the kenotic doctrine, which again Lewis called it. And according to it, they imagine that the divinity was taken away from the Word in Christ. It is a wicked invention, equally to be condemned with the Docetism opposed to it. It reduces the whole mystery of the incarnation and redemption to empty the bloodless imaginations with the entire and perfect nature of man. Thus grandly St. Leo the Great says, and I quote, "He who was true God was born, complete in his own nature, complete in ours." So you cannot say that Christ's knowledge in his divine intellect went from being a current or actual to being merely dispositional or in potency or potentia. So this is heretical. This is and does make you an enemy of the faith of Chalcedon, according to Pope Pius XII, and it goes against the Catholic religion and makes you outside of the Catholic religion. So I want to know if people like Rob and Chris and Lewis and Shamoon and Avery and all of your favorite Christian apologists, David Wood, if they're actually going to take the advice of Christian Wagner and realize that the position that they've been representing for some time now is actually heretical according to the dogmatic teachings of the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and even some Protestant churches like the Lutherans. I wonder if he's going to take their advice. I think that they won't, and that they're going to double and triple down in their heresy. And I will put a link in the description of this video to everything that was referenced. Dean's discussion with Chris and Rob, my discussion and presentation of the Agnoite heresy on Dean's channel, a link to my presentation on academia, a link to Chris and Rob's discussion, as I said, with Dean, a link to Lewis's debate with Libiano, a link to Shamoon's article where he is representing this heretical view, a link to both Lofton and Wagner's explanations of the agnoete, as well as to the clip that I played from Timothy Paul, and a link to all three Catholic links that I displayed on the screen in explaining the Catholic position. All of that will be available to you, and I challenge all of these Christian apologists, if they're willing to have a discussion with me on this, I will prove to them that they actually are heretics or representing heretical positions according to the mainstream Orthodox with a lowercase o teaching. If anybody has a doubt about that, come speak to me about it on my channel. But I want to say one thing. This is a new era between Christian and Muslim debates where Muslims are actually reading your sources. We're going back to what you guys say and your own theologians teach. And then in debates and in discussion contexts, we actually have to explain to you what the correct Christian teaching is and then explain to you why it's problematic or wrong. I'm not saying that this is a good interpretation of the biblical text. This is actually a proof against Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and the churches that teach that you must interpret the Scripture this way, because the Scripture obviously isn't teaching this. So this is actually an argument against Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestant churches who teach that you must interpret the text in this fashion, because the text obviously doesn't teach this and says quite the opposite. And in addition to that, as John Henry Newman and other saints in their church, later saints in their church admit, that many of the early church fathers like Athanasius, Ambrose, and others did not actually teach this. They actually taught that Christ was ignorant of the hour in his human nature, which shows that Christianity constantly is going through a development. Even when they agree that Jesus Christ is supposedly God or homoousion with the Father, there are later heresies that come about. Did Christ have a human mind and human soul? And if he did, was it limited in knowledge in the sense that he didn't know the hour? Athanasius says yes, but that would be condemned later as a heresy according to the Catholic Church. So this is a massive problem on many levels for all of your favorite Christian apologists, as well as for the Bible and the dogmatic teachings of these churches. It actually proves that these churches cannot be correct because they're going so far away from the obvious and apparent meaning of the biblical scriptures. If you guys enjoyed this video and the content on my channel and would like to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you get notified of future videos. Like, comment, let me know your thoughts on this one, guys. Share this on your social media platforms or with your friends and family. No matter how big or how small your reach is, it really does help with the algorithm, guys. But until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.